At the opening of the 18th century, Hartford stood along the Connecticut River, a modest colonial town shaped by English settlement patterns, river access, and surrounding agricultural lands that supported a dispersed but increasingly interconnected community in early years. Founded in the 17th century, Hartford entered the 1700s with established institutions, including churches and local governance, reflecting Puritan traditions that continued to influence social organization, land distribution, and communal responsibilities across households and neighborhoods. Geographically, Hartford occupied a strategic position along the Connecticut River, which functioned as a primary transportation corridor, enabling movement of goods and people while linking inland farms to coastal markets, reinforcing the town's importance within regional trade networks. Agriculture formed the backbone of Hartford's early economy, with residents cultivating corn, wheat, and livestock, while small-scale trade and craftsmanship supplemented livelihoods, creating a mixed economy that balanced subsistence needs with emerging commercial opportunities. The river's seasonal rhythms influenced daily life, as spring floods enriched farmland but also posed risks, requiring adaptation in settlement placement and agricultural planning, embedding environmental awareness into the town's practical decision-making processes. Religious institutions remain central, with meetinghouses serving not only as places of worship but also as venues for civic discussion, reinforcing a social structure in which moral expectations and communal oversight were closely intertwined. By the early 18th century, Hartford's population grew gradually, attracting migrants from surrounding areas, which contributed to expanding land use and necessitated more formalized systems of property ownership and local administration. Local governance operated through town meetings, where property-owning men participated in decisions affecting taxation, infrastructure, and defense, illustrating a participatory political structure that, while limited in scope, fostered a sense of collective responsibility. Trade connections extended beyond the immediate region, as merchants in Hartford engaged with coastal ports, exchanging agricultural surplus and locally produced goods for imported items, integrating the town into the broader Atlantic economy. Craft industries developed alongside agriculture, including blacksmithing, carpentry, and milling, which provided essential services and supported the town's gradual economic diversification without fundamentally altering its agrarian character. Education began to take a more structured form, with the establishment of schools aimed at literacy and religious instruction, ensuring that younger generations could read scripture and participate effectively in civic and religious life. Social hierarchies were evident, with wealthier landowners exerting greater influence, while laborers and smaller farmers occupied more limited positions, reflecting inequalities that shaped access to resources and decision-making authority. The legal framework of Hartford drew from English common law, adapted to local conditions, governing property disputes, contracts, and social conduct, reinforcing order within a growing and increasingly complex community. By mid-century, Hartford's economic patterns showed signs of change, as increased trade activity encouraged specialization, with some residents focusing more heavily on commerce while others expanded agricultural production to meet demand. The presence of the Connecticut River continued to define Hartford's role within the colony, acting as both a conduit for opportunity and a boundary shaping expansion, influencing patterns of settlement and economic interaction. Interactions with neighboring towns created a network of exchange and cooperation, as goods, labor, and information moved between communities, contributing to regional stability and shared development across Connecticut. As British imperial policies evolved, colonial towns like Hartford experienced increasing oversight, particularly in matters of trade regulation and taxation, which began to influence local economic decisions and political attitudes. The imposition of imperial controls affected merchants and farmers alike, introducing constraints that sometimes conflicted with established practices, gradually fostering discontent among segments of the population. Social cohesion remained strong, however, as shared religious beliefs and communal traditions continued to provide a framework for cooperation, even as external pressures introduced new tensions into daily life. By the 1760s, Hartford residents became more aware of their position within the British Empire, as debates over rights and governance reached even inland communities, shaping local discourse and political awareness. Economic dependencies on British trade complicated responses to imperial policies, as resistance carried potential risks, illustrating the delicate balance between economic necessity and emerging political convictions. Over time, these evolving conditions contributed to a broader transformation, as Hartford's established institutions and economic structures began adapting to changing realities, laying the groundwork for future developments that would extend beyond the colonial period. By the early 1770s, Hartford had developed into a more structured colonial town, with its institutions firmly established and its population accustomed to a rhythm of life shaped by agriculture, trade, and the persistent influence of British governance. The Connecticut River remained central to Hartford's function, serving as a reliable artery for transporting goods, especially agricultural produce, timber, and livestock, toward coastal markets where colonial merchants engaged in wider Atlantic exchange systems. Economic activity in Hartford reflected both continuity and strain, as local producers relied on established trade routes while facing increasing pressure from imperial regulations that restricted commerce and altered long-standing patterns of exchange and profitability. Merchants in Hartford began adjusting their practices, seeking alternative markets or reducing dependence on British imports, a shift that subtly reoriented the town's economic relationships without immediately severing its ties to imperial systems. These economic adjustments were accompanied by growing awareness of political developments, as news of legislation such as the Townshend Acts circulated through print and conversation, informing residents of shifting policies that directly affected colonial livelihoods. Public discussion expanded within meetinghouses and informal gatherings, where residents debated the implications of British taxation and governance, reflecting a gradual shift from passive acceptance toward more active engagement with imperial authority. Hartford's political culture, rooted in town meetings and local participation, provided a foundation for organized response, enabling residents to articulate concerns and coordinate actions within an established framework of communal decision-making. Committees of correspondence began to emerge, facilitating communication between Hartford and other towns, ensuring that information about political developments and responses circulated efficiently across the colony and beyond. These networks contributed to a shared colonial perspective, aligning Hartford's interests with those of neighboring communities, and reinforcing a sense of collective identity that extended beyond local boundaries. Economic resistance took practical forms, including non-importation agreements, where merchants and consumers reduced reliance on British goods, demonstrating how economic behavior became a tool of political expression and coordinated opposition. Such measures had immediate effects within Hartford, as availability of certain goods declined, requiring adaptation among households and businesses, while also strengthening local production and encouraging self-reliance in key areas. Social consequences followed, as participation in resistance efforts became a marker of communal loyalty, and those who did not comply risked social exclusion, illustrating how political tensions translated into everyday interactions and relationships. Despite these pressures, Hartford maintained a degree of stability, as its established institutions continued to function, providing continuity even as the broader political environment grew increasingly uncertain and contested. By the mid-1770s, the escalation of conflict between Britain and the colonies began to reshape Hartford's priorities, with greater attention given to defense, organization, and the potential for military engagement. Local militias became more active, conducting drills and preparing for possible conflict, reflecting a transition from political resistance to practical readiness, while reinforcing communal bonds through shared purpose and obligation. Hartford's geographic position, inland yet connected by river routes, offered a degree of insulation from immediate coastal conflict, while still allowing participation in regional coordination and support for broader colonial efforts. The town contributed resources and manpower to the emerging revolutionary cause, illustrating how even inland communities became integrated into a larger network of resistance that extended across the colonies. Economic life continued under strain, as disruptions to trade affected income and availability of goods, yet these challenges also accelerated shifts toward local production and internal exchange systems. Political authority within Hartford increasingly aligned with colonial assemblies rather than imperial directives, marking a gradual but significant reorientation of governance and legitimacy in the eyes of many residents. This transition was not without complexity, as loyalties varied among individuals, and some residents maintained connections to British authority, creating a nuanced social landscape marked by differing perspectives and interests. Over time, Hartford's response to these pressures reflected both adaptation and continuity, as its institutions absorbed new functions while maintaining familiar structures, enabling the town to navigate a period of significant transformation. These developments collectively signaled a deeper structural change, as Hartford moved from a colonial settlement operating within imperial frameworks toward a community increasingly defined by its participation in a broader movement for autonomy and self-governance. By 1775, Hartford had become an inland administrative and logistical center within Connecticut, supporting revolutionary coordination efforts through town governance, militia organization, and supply distribution aligned with emerging wartime demands across the region during escalating conflict conditions locally. Regionally, the Connecticut River provided Hartford with sustained access